400 years ago, a man was burned alive in a public square in Rome, in part, according to many historians, for suggesting that the universe might contain other inhabited worlds. That single detail should already tell you this question is older than telescopes powerful enough to actually answer it. The Catholic Church's relationship with the idea of life beyond Earth didn't begin with NASA, and it isn't going to end with a Pentagon press release either. What you're about to learn is that this question has already been asked, seriously, repeatedly, at the highest levels of the Vatican itself, not as a hypothetical thought experiment for late-night television, but as an actual working theological and scientific research question pursued by Jesuit astronomers with real telescopes, real doctorates, and real institutional backing stretching back over 400 years. And the answers they've already given, on the record, are not what most people assume the Church would say. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what one of the world's oldest religious institutions has already said, in its own words, about extraterrestrial life, what it considers settled, what remains genuinely open, and why the answer to this question might matter less for what it says about aliens, and more for what it reveals about the actual limits and surprising flexibility of religious institutions confronting discoveries their founders could never have imagined. But to understand where this is heading, you first need to understand where it started, and it didn't start well. Here's the scene you need to understand before anything else makes sense. In the late 16th century, a Dominican friar and philosopher named Giordano Bruno began publicly arguing for an infinite universe filled with countless suns, each potentially hosting its own inhabited worlds, a direct challenge to the prevailing Earth-centered cosmology the Church had built much of its theological framework around. Bruno was arrested by the Roman Inquisition, tried for multiple charges including his cosmological views, and burned at the stake in 1600. Historians still debate exactly how much of his execution was specifically about extraterrestrial life versus his broader heresies, but the case became, fairly or not, a symbol of institutional religion violently rejecting the idea of a universe not centered on humanity. That symbol shaped public assumptions for centuries, even as the actual institution quietly moved in a very different direction. The Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical research institutions on Earth, traces its roots back to the Gregorian Calendar Reform Commission of 1582 and was formally refounded by Pope Leo III in 1891, specifically to demonstrate, in the Pope's own stated intent, that the Church supported serious scientific inquiry rather than opposing it. Today, it operates two facilities. Its historic headquarters at the Papal Summer Residence in Castel Gandolfo outside Rome, and its primary research telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, located at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Staffing that observatory, generation after generation, has been a small, unusual community. Jesuit priests who are also working, publishing astronomers, holding actual doctorates in astrophysics, planetary science, and cosmology from major secular universities. This isn't a public relations gesture. Vatican astronomers have contributed to real scientific work, identifying atmospheric optical phenomena, participating in NASA research on binary star system formation, and playing a documented role in the scientific reclassification debate around Pluto. That's the institutional backdrop most people covering this topic skip entirely, and it's exactly why the Church's actual position on extraterrestrial life turns out to be far more developed and far less defensive than Bruno's execution centuries ago would ever suggest. Here's the assumption most people walk into this question with, and it's an entirely reasonable one on the surface. Organized religion, especially one built around humanity's unique relationship with God, and a single historical incarnation of Christ on Earth, should logically resist or reject the idea of other intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe. If humans are made in God's image, and Christ came specifically to save humanity, doesn't confirmed alien intelligence create an unsolvable theological contradiction? That reasoning isn't fringe internet speculation. It's a genuinely serious question theologians have wrestled with for decades, and on paper, it looks like it should produce institutional resistance. Except that's not remotely what the actual documented record shows. In May 2008, Father José Gabriel Funes, the Jesuit director of the Vatican Observatory at the time, gave an interview to the Vatican's own official newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, under the headline, "The Extraterrestrial is My Brother." In it, Funes stated plainly that given the scale of the universe, over 100 billion galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, many hosting planets, it would be difficult to rule out that life, including intelligent life, had developed somewhere else. He went further, arguing that ruling out extraterrestrial life entirely would actually mean placing limits on God's own creative freedom, which he considered theologically backwards. That's already a crack in the assumed narrative, and it gets stranger from there. Funes wasn't simply tolerating the idea as a harmless hypothetical the church could shrug off. He was actively framing it using explicitly Catholic theological language, invoking St. Francis of Assisi's tradition of referring to earthly creatures as brother and sister, and suggesting the same language could logically extend to an extraterrestrial brother, still fully part of God's creation. An official Vatican newspaper publishing that framing, under that specific headline, wasn't the church quietly tolerating a fringe idea. It was, according to fellow Vatican astronomer Brother Guy Consolmagno's own public comment at the time, evidence that the Vatican hierarchy agrees that there's no problem, a considerably stronger institutional signal than most outside observers expected, and exactly the kind of detail that should make you start questioning what else you assumed was settled here. If this story needs a central voice, someone thinking seriously about this question long before most institutions were willing to engage with it publicly, that person is a Dominican theologian named Father Thomas F. O'Mara, a retired professor at the University of Notre Dame who spent decades studying this exact intersection, culminating in his book Vast Universe, Extraterrestrials and Christian Revelation. O'Mara wasn't a fringe figure shouting into the void. He was a credentialed Catholic theologian, working within the institution, making an argument the wider church took years to catch up with publicly. O'Mara's core argument, laid out well before this became a mainstream media topic, was that the sheer scale of the universe, billions of planets, increasing the statistical likelihood of both life and intelligent life existing elsewhere, was actually consistent with, rather than opposed to, historical Catholic thought. He specifically pointed to St. Thomas Aquinas, arguing that Aquinas' own 13th century view of a vast, diverse creation, built from limited medieval observations of plants, animals, and stars, logically extends to a universe considerably larger and more diverse than Aquinas could have ever imagined, without requiring any revision to the underlying theological framework. For years, arguments like O'Mara's existed mostly within academic theology circles and Vatican Observatory publications, rarely reaching mainstream religious audiences who still largely assumed, based on the Bruno legend, that the Church's official posture toward extraterrestrial life was hostile or dismissive. That gap between the informed theological position and the popular assumption is exactly the frustration worth sitting with here. A serious, decades-old body of Catholic scholarship existed on this question, developed by credentialed theologians working from inside the institution, and it took a viral newspaper headline in 2008 for most of the public to even learn it existed at all. So let's actually walk through what changed the conversation in specific, documented detail. The 2008 Funes interview wasn't an isolated comment, it was part of a sustained institutional pattern that continued developing over the following decade and a half. In that same interview, Funes directly addressed the most difficult theological question in this entire topic: redemption. If Christ's incarnation on earth was a singular historical event, meant to save humanity specifically, what happens theologically if intelligent beings exist elsewhere who never experienced anything equivalent? Funes' answer, citing the gospel parable of the shepherd who leaves 99 sheep to search for a single lost one, was genuinely striking in its implications. He suggested that humanity itself might be the theological exception, not the rule, the lost sheep, specifically requiring redemption because of humanity's own history, while other intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe might have, in his words, remained in full friendship with their Creator and simply never needed the kind of redemption Christ's incarnation provided for humans specifically. He was careful to affirm that Christ's incarnation and sacrifice remained a unique, unrepeatable historical event tied specifically to Earth, while simultaneously leaving open the possibility that God's mercy could be extended to other beings in whatever form was theologically appropriate for them. This wasn't treated as a one-time thought experiment. Father Funes went on to found and lead something called Project Other, a Spanish-language acronym for Otros Mundos, Tierra, Humanidad y Espacio Remoto, meaning other worlds, Earth, humanity, and remote space, based at the Catholic University of Córdoba in Argentina, formally bringing together astronomers, biologists, philosophers, and theologians specifically to study both the scientific possibility of intelligent extraterrestrial life and its potential philosophical and religious implications for humanity. That's not rhetoric, that's an actual funded, ongoing academic research initiative inside a Catholic university built around exactly the question this video is asking you to sit with. Once Funes' comments went public in 2008, they didn't go unchallenged, and the pushback came from a genuinely important direction worth understanding fully. Conservative and biblically literalist Christian organizations, including groups like Answers in Genesis, published direct theological rebuttals, arguing that Funes' position represented exactly the kind of scriptural compromise they considered dangerous, specifically objecting to his suggestion that some extraterrestrial beings might exist free from original sin, which they argued directly contradicted Romans 8:22's description of the whole creation groaning under the weight of sin since humanity's fall. That theological objection matters because it reveals something important. There was, and still is, no single unified Christian position on this question, even within traditions that broadly share core doctrine. Funes' own Vatican Observatory colleague, Brother Guy Consolmagno, had explored remarkably similar themes years earlier in his own published writing, suggesting a genuine, internally consistent line of Jesuit astronomical theology had been developing for years before it reached mainstream headlines, while simultaneously, biblical literalist traditions outside Catholicism were reaching the opposite conclusion using the same starting scripture, arguing instead that humanity's uniqueness as the sole intelligent creation was itself theologically necessary. The investigation deepened further in 2015, following the discovery of Kepler 452b, a so-called super-Earth, located roughly 1,400 light-years away, sitting inside its star's habitable zone. Pope Francis himself was directly asked about the theological implications during this period, and rather than deflecting, he offered a specific, memorable hypothetical. If Martians came to Earth, he said, and one of them asked to be baptized, what would happen? He wasn't treating the question as absurd. He was treating it as a genuine pastoral scenario worth thinking through seriously, extending the Church's sacramental framework toward a hypothetical it had never previously needed to formally address, rather than ruling the possibility out on principle. Here's what genuinely remains unresolved, even after everything you've just heard, and it's worth being honest about exactly where the theological consensus actually breaks down rather than pretending this question has a tidy answer. The incarnation question specifically, whether Christ's sacrifice on earth applies universally or exclusively to humanity, has been debated by serious Catholic theologians for decades without producing anything resembling institutional consensus. Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who died in 1984 and remains one of the most influential Catholic theologians of the 20th century, spent considerable scholarly attention on exactly this question without reaching a definitive answer the wider Church has since formally adopted. Father Thomas O'Mara's own position, that the incarnation doesn't require that Jesus also be incarnate on other planets, represents one serious theological direction, essentially proposing that Christ's earthly sacrifice could be sufficient and universal without needing repetition elsewhere. But that position exists alongside other serious theological proposals suggesting multiple incarnations, universal but non-identical redemption, or forms of divine relationship with other intelligent beings that simply don't map onto human theological categories at all, and critically, none of these positions has been formally adopted as official Catholic doctrine, because the Church has, quite deliberately, never issued a binding dogmatic statement on a question it considers scientifically unconfirmed. That's the detail worth sitting with as the mystery accumulates rather than resolves. Even Father Funes himself, as recently as a Zoom interview in June 2021, conducted from Cordoba shortly after the U.S. Department of Defense's expected UAP report, was careful to warn that serious theological engagement with extraterrestrial life could veer into the realm of conspiracy theories that depart from true science, a caution suggesting that even the Vatican's own leading voice on this topic remains wary of treating current UFO disclosure content as equivalent to the confirmed scientific discovery that would actually trigger the deeper theological questions his own career has spent decades preparing for. Here's the moment that actually reframes everything you've just heard, and it deserves to be understood as the genuine turning point it was. For most of Church history, extraterrestrial life was a purely speculative theological exercise, something theologians could debate in the abstract precisely because there was no scientific mechanism to ever test it. That changed, gradually but decisively, with the emergence of a specific scientific technique astronomers now call biomarker detection, analyzing the light spectrum passing through a distant exoplanet's atmosphere as it transits its host star, searching for chemical signatures like specific ratios of oxygen, methane, or other gases that would be difficult to explain without biological activity producing them. Funes himself specifically flagged this technique in his original 2008 interview, noting that astronomy was actively developing the capability to identify biomarkers in the spectral analysis of distant stars and planets, meaning the Vatican's own chief astronomer was pointing toward a concrete, near-future scientific pathway toward an actual answer, not treating this as permanently unknowable. That single detail transforms this entire story from abstract theology into something with an actual timeline attached to it. The question stopped being purely philosophical the moment a working scientific method existed that could, in principle, produce real evidence within the professional lifetime of astronomers currently working the field, including those wearing Roman collars alongside their observatory badges. That's the cinematic weight of this turn, if you sit with it properly. The Church isn't waiting to formulate a position after the fact, scrambling to catch up the way popular assumption suggests it would. Its own astronomers have been actively involved in developing the exact scientific tools that could eventually settle the question, while its theologians have spent decades quietly building the doctrinal framework to receive whatever answer those tools eventually produce, meaning the discovery, if it comes, wouldn't hit an unprepared institution. It would hit one that has been explicitly rehearsing this exact scenario since at least 2008, and arguably, in less formal terms, since Aquinas. If this story has one physical element worth understanding as its own character, it's the Vatican Observatory itself, not as a symbol, but as an actual functioning scientific institution with a genuinely unusual dual identity. Operating simultaneously as a legitimate astrophysics research center and as a formal arm of one of the world's oldest religious institutions, the observatory occupies a position no other scientific body on Earth quite matches. Its researchers hold real doctorates from secular universities, publish in the same peer-reviewed journals as any other working astronomer, and simultaneously operate within, and explicitly serve, a specific theological tradition. That dual nature is precisely what makes the observatory functionally important to this entire question, rather than simply a historical curiosity. It represents the only institution on Earth structurally positioned to receive a confirmed extraterrestrial intelligence discovery through both a rigorous scientific lens and an immediate, prepared theological framework, without needing to build either capability from scratch after the fact. Every other major religious tradition would, in that scenario, be starting its theological reckoning essentially from zero, in real time, under intense public pressure. The Vatican Observatory has spent over a century, and especially the last 2 decades, deliberately avoiding that exact position. That's why this element matters more than a single quote or a single pope's comment. Institutions, unlike individuals, move slowly and leave behind documented records of their thinking, and the Vatican Observatory's documented record, stretching from Funes's 2008 interview through Project Other's ongoing academic work, shows a genuine, sustained, multi-decade institutional effort to think this question through carefully, in advance, rather than reactively. Whatever your own views on faith or science, that's a genuinely unusual thing for any major institution to have done this early, this thoroughly, about a discovery that, as of today, still hasn't actually happened. So here's exactly where the confirmed record leaves you, without exaggerating in either direction. It's documented, through an official Vatican newspaper interview, that the Church's own chief astronomer stated clearly that belief in extraterrestrial intelligent life does not contradict Catholic faith, and that ruling it out entirely would theologically limit God's creative freedom. That's not internet speculation, that's on the institutional record, published under an official Vatican masthead. It's also documented that this position has been sustained and developed further over more than a decade, through Project Other's ongoing academic work, and through Pope Francis's own public comments engaging seriously with the hypothetical. What remains genuinely unresolved, and likely to stay unresolved until an actual confirmed discovery forces the question, is the deeper theological mechanics. Whether the incarnation applies universally, whether other intelligent beings would require redemption in any form resembling humanity's, and how any of this would be formally received by the broader billion-plus global Catholic population, most of whom have likely never heard of Father Funes, Project Other, or any of the theological groundwork already laid. An observatory director's interview and a small research initiative in Cordoba are genuinely significant institutional signals, but they are not the same thing as a settled catechism, and the gap between the Church's leading astronomer theologians have thought carefully about this, and the global Church has a unified pastoral response ready to deploy, remains real, and, as of today, untested by anything beyond hypothetical scenarios. What has changed, concretely, is that the assumption most people walk into this question carrying, that organized religion would instinctively reject or resist confirmed extraterrestrial intelligence, simply doesn't match the documented institutional record of the world's largest single religious body. Whatever happens with the current wave of government UAP disclosures, whatever eventually comes from biomarker analysis of distant exoplanets, The theological groundwork for at least one major tradition has already been under construction for well over a decade, in public, in the institution's own words. There's something genuinely worth sitting with in the fact that an institution often assumed to be the most resistant to this kind of discovery has instead spent decades quietly preparing for it, using its own scientists, its own theologians, and its own official publications to think through a question most of the world still treats as pure science fiction. That doesn't mean the Church has all the answers ready. It means it has been honest enough to admit, repeatedly and on the record, that it doesn't yet have all the answers, while still doing the actual intellectual work required to be ready for whichever answer eventually arrives. Some of the most significant reckonings in the history of human belief have started exactly this way, not with a final answer, but with an institution willing to say, in advance and out loud, "We don't know yet, but we're taking the question seriously." Whatever you believe about God, about the universe, or about what's actually sitting in a distant planet's atmospheric spectrum waiting to be read, that specific kind of intellectual honesty, from an institution 4 centuries removed from burning a man alive for asking a similar question, might be the most quietly remarkable part of this entire story.